Have you ever noticed how just a single word, like a bit of slang, some insider jargon, or even just like the casual way we talk every day, can instantly reveal a lot about a specific time or a place, or even like a whole subculture? It's like language has this secret power to embed hidden meanings and like unlock whole worlds that you wouldn't even know were there.
It's true. Language is so much more than just, a way of conveying information. I mean, it's like a living, breathing record, constantly changing and adapting, right? It reflects those tiny, subtle shifts as unique things that make a community distinct.
Yeah. And that brings us to this deep dive, something a listener recommended, and we were super excited about it. Ken Kesey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
Hmm.
I think one of the things that struck both of us right away was how the language Kesey uses is just as compelling and like multi-layered as the story itself.
Absolutely. Kesey was a master at capturing the way people talked back then. And the way he recreates the specific kind of language of the mental institution, it's just so vivid and immersive. You feel like you're right there in the ward with them.
That's exactly it. So our goal in this deep dive is to break down some of that fascinating vocabulary and those unique expressions that Kesey uses.
Yeah.
We want to see how those linguistic choices give us a deeper understanding of the characters in the story, the environment of the ward, and those huge themes Kesey is tackling. This is more than just like a typical book report. It's about seeing how language shapes our whole perception of reality, especially in a place as strange and as isolated as this mental institution. So let's jump right in, starting with the slang and those kind of informal, sometimes raw expressions that the patients use, especially McMurphy.
One thing that really jumps out is the stark difference between the kind of formal language you'd expect in a hospital setting and the blunt, casual way the patients talk, especially McMurphy. Like when he says, "What's the bid?" It tells us so much more than just, that he knows how to gamble. You immediately see him as this man of action, a risk taker, which is a huge contrast to the passivity and the like subdued atmosphere of the ward. It maybe even hints at his potential to really shake things up in there.
Totally. And then there are those moments when his speech is so direct and urgent, like when he shouts, "Come on, Martini." It's almost jarring, that sudden burst of life and energy.
Hmm.
What do you think that kind of directness tells us about the atmosphere of the ward before McMurphy arrives?
It really emphasizes how stagnant and controlled everything is. His language is like a direct challenge to that stillness. He refuses to be subdued by the environment. Even something simple like get a grip on yourself. It's so straightforward, almost defiant, right?
Yeah.
He doesn't use any polite or clinical phrasing. He just cuts right to the chase.
Yeah, it's refreshing. And then you have those really emphatic, almost exaggerated expressions.
Hmm.
When he says, "That's a hell of a fish," he doesn't just mean it was a big fish. He's adding that hell of to really amplify his wonder and excitement, like a real appreciation for something outside of the mundane. And then there's that slightly older slang, like, "Isn't that a dandy?" It gives him this cool retro vibe, almost like a charming rebel.
Definitely. That use of old-fashioned slang makes his speech unique and sets him apart from the way the staff talks, which is much more formal and restrained. Now think about how they express disbelief or when they think something is nonsense. Phrases like, knock off the bullshit, blah, 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 and baloney. They're just so direct, no sugarcoating.
They really cut through the BS, don't they? Knock off the bullshit becomes almost like McMurphy's personal mantra. It's this demand for authenticity in a place that feels fake and controlled and blah, blah, blah. It's such a wonderfully dismissive way of saying, "I don't care about this. It's unimportant." Baloney kind of serves the same purpose, a simple, informal way of rejecting something.
And then there are those rougher but undeniably powerful questions like, when are you going to get that through your fucking head? That raw frustration, that anger conveyed in such direct language, it really shows the intensity of the emotions in the ward. And the
Hmm.
way they use bullshit as a verb, like, he's bullshitting me, right? It shows their casual but defiant attitude towards authority and what's considered true in that environment.
Stepping back for a second, this informal, sometimes crude language becomes a really significant part of how the patients resist the system, even if it's mostly verbal.
Yeah.
What do you think about the role this language plays in helping them maintain their own identity and sense of rebellion in such a restrictive place?
It's like they draw a line with their language, creating this in-group identity through their shared slang and informal talk, and it deliberately excludes the formal language of the institution. By using this bluntness, they push back against the power structures that are embedded in more polite or clinical ways of speaking. It's a way for them to assert their own reality. They're refusing to be fully absorbed by the institution's rules, even when it comes to the words they use.
It's like their own form of protest. And that resistance extends to their interactions, like when they're gambling or talking about sports. When someone yells out, "You got 20 showing." During a card game, you're right there with them, feeling the tension and excitement. And the baseball references, like pitching the opener, it's like they bring a little bit of the outside world, a little bit of American culture and shared fun right into that confined space.
And it's not just the individual phrases, but the way those different aspects of their lives come together in their language. They're using this very casual slang in the high stakes environment of a competitive game, like play the game and knock off the bullshit. It's this interesting mix of a playful challenge and that constant demand for honesty, which is really at the core of McMurphy's character.
Definitely. And then you have the insults and the way they talk about being crazy or cowardly. Do you nuts want to play cards or do you want to jack off? It's crude, confrontational, but it also hints at the boredom and the underlying tension and frustration in that environment. And those quick, dismissive terms like damn lunatic or chicken shits, there's so much raw emotion in the way they're delivered. What do you think that kind of language tells us about their relationships with each other?
While those terms can definitely be hurtful, there's this paradoxical sense of camaraderie that comes through. They acknowledge their shared predicament. It's almost like bonding through the language of their confinement and their shared frustrations, a kind of harsh intimacy, you could say.
It's true. McMurphy's insistence on saying knock off the bullshit really becomes the central point of conflict with the authorities, especially Nurse Ratched. It's as if he's constantly challenging her facade, demanding a level of honesty and transparency that she just doesn't seem capable of giving.
It's his main weapon against her carefully constructed authority. He refuses to engage with her on her terms, those formal and often manipulative ways she uses language. And by doing that, he exposes the power dynamics and forces her to confront the raw, blunt reality that he represents.
Yeah. And those tiny glimpses of everyday life that sneak into their slang are so revealing. Wiener for a hot dog, the excitement of a home run. It's a constant reminder that these are individuals who still have connections to the outside world, to simple pleasures and shared experiences.
Those details are crucial for humanizing the patients. They're reminders of their lives and who they were before they ended up in the institution. And there's this underlying longing for normalcy, for connection to the familiar things in American culture.
You can also see different levels of politeness reflected in their slang. Get the lead out is this very direct, almost impatient way of saying hurry up. But then you have what the hell and the slightly softer what the heck. They show different degrees of surprise or emphasis, maybe even offer a glimpse into the speaker's personality or how seriously they're taking the situation.
It's fascinating how that slight shift between hell and heck creates such a noticeable difference. What the heck has a more old-fashioned feel, which could be intentional on Kesey's part, a way to further define certain characters or reflect the time period of the novel.
And then there are those brutal terms for the institution itself, the can, the Phoebe farm, loony bin. They're so negative, so dehumanizing, and they really emphasize how awful the experience of being confined and labeled is for these patients. What impact do you think those terms have on their sense of self?
It's incredibly damaging. Especially Phoebe Farm, it diminishes their intelligence and reinforces a sense of worthlessness. When they internalize and use these labels themselves, it erodes their sense of identity and their feeling of having any control over their lives. It reflects the power of the institution to define and control them, even down to the words they use to describe themselves.
It's really sad. We also get that brief, almost unexpected use of military slang, like aye, aye, sir. It reminds us of McMurphy's past and maybe hints at a lingering respect for certain forms of authority, even if it's a bit twisted. And then there's that simple encouragement, hold it steady. During the fishing trip, it's such a small moment, but it speaks volumes about the growing sense of camaraderie and support among them.
That little bit of military jargon gives us some background on McMurphy and contrasts with the chaos he brings to the ward. It suggests a more structured past. And yeah, hold it steady. During that fishing trip, it really highlights the unity and the shared purpose he's fostering among the patients.
Even the nicknames they use, that little devil, son of a gun, sucker, they have such different tones depending on the context. Affection, dismissal, it all depends on who's saying it and what they mean.
The nuance is really important. That little devil can be playful, even endearing. Son of a gun often expresses surprise, maybe even a bit of grudging admiration. And sucker can be a put down, but sometimes it's playful teasing, depending on the relationship.
And those blunt rejections, like, oh, fuck that shit, is pretty unambiguous. And then expressions of aging and feeling like they're losing their vitality, like being too old to get it up. It's raw, it's vulnerable, and it speaks to a loss of physical power and a sense of diminished potential.
It's really stripping away any pretense. They lay bare their vulnerabilities, their frustration with their physical limitations, and the deeper anxiety about aging and losing control over their own bodies.
And we can't forget that desperate cry for freedom, let me loose. And then there's Nurse Ratched's constant use of the word hassling. It really highlights how she sees the patients as troublesome and in need of constant control. How do you see that contrast in their language reflecting those completely different perspectives?
It perfectly encapsulates the whole power struggle, right? You have let me loose expressing this basic human desire for freedom and autonomy, and then you have Nurse Ratched using hassling, which basically says their natural desires are disruptive and need to be managed. It's her need to control versus their need to be free.
Absolutely. And that distinction between being voluntary and being committed in the context of the institution is so significant. It really shapes how the patients see themselves and each other.
It's crucial to understanding their agency within the ward. Someone who's there voluntarily, like Harding initially, has a different sense of control compared to someone who's been committed against their will. That difference plays a big role in their behavior and how they interact with the staff and other patients.
For sure. And we also hear those little bits of dated slang, like holly roller shit and send me, which really helps to anchor the story in a specific time period.
Those slang terms definitely ground the novel in its historical context. It's a reminder of the language people used back then, and probably reflects Keyes' familiarity with the way people talked when he was writing the book.
And the phrase, take a load of these tubs, compared to the more modern get a load of something, it shows how slang changes over time, but the basic idea stays the same.
It's a perfect example of how language is constantly evolving. New expressions pop up, but they often convey similar concepts. It's like a linguistic evolution.
Even the casual terms for everyday things, like calling a walk a stroll or using get you high to talk about drugs, feel very much rooted in their experiences within the ward.
It becomes part of their shared vocabulary, reflecting their daily routines and their desire to escape. It's the language of their confined existence.
And then there are these moments when a completely unexpected reference pops up, like the mention of the Easter Bunny in a pretty serious conversation, or the ironic use of executive lounge. It creates this strange, surreal feeling, like different realities are colliding within the ward. What do you think is the effect of those unexpected juxtapositions?
It's really powerful. It disrupts the normal flow of conversation, highlighting how absurd their situation is. Maybe it shows their lingering connection to a world outside the institution, a world that's becoming increasingly distant.
Right, and that unusual grammatical construction, don't nothing me, it just stands out as a unique feature of how these characters communicate.
It's non-standard grammar, but it adds to the authenticity of their voices. It emphasizes that their approach to language is informal and unconventional.
And McMurphy's direct use of a date to mean sex, it's so blunt, challenging those polite social conventions around talking about intimacy.
Okay, so we've done a pretty thorough job with the slang. Let's shift gears and talk about the more formal and psychological language that also shows up in the book. What's interesting is how Kesey weaves in the clinical language of the institution, often contrasting it with the casual, informal way the patients talk. Words like evaluated and mentally ill are used almost exclusively by the staff. Being evaluated implies a formal process of assessment, while mentally ill, although it seems straightforward, it carries a lot of weight. It covers a wide range of experiences, from temporary emotional distress to more severe, long-term psychological conditions.
Right, and then there's Harding's self-assessment. As near as I can figure it out, I fight and fuck too much. Figure it out. Here suggests a process of self-reflection, and it's interesting how he describes what he sees as his flaws so directly and almost humorously.
It's definitely self-aware, but in his own way. He combines intellectual language with the casualness and self-deprecation that's kind of his trademark.
We also have the formal penitentiary, to refer to prison, and the legal term assault, reminding us of the consequences of their actions and the external world they're not entirely cut off from.
Those terms bring in the legal and penal systems, reminding us that the institution existed within a larger societal framework with its own rules and consequences. They're not completely isolated from the outside world.
And the language of suspicion, words like suspect and speculate, it reflects that constant paranoia and uncertainty hanging over the ward.
They're always trying to figure out what's going on, what people's motives are. Trust is a fragile thing in that environment.
Nurse Ratched uses this dismissive, clinical language, when talking to the patients, like when she says she doesn't meet your mental requirements. It's such a cold way of saying somebody isn't intelligent enough, there's no empathy there. What do you think about how this kind of language contributes to her power?
It's a key part of how she controls them. It creates distance, hiding her personal biases behind this mask of authority. It not only dismisses their intelligence, but also makes differences seem like something that needs to be managed, not a natural variation in people. It's all about control.
It's dehumanizing. And then we have Harding using a word like juxtaposition. It instantly shows his intelligence and his ability to analyze the crazy situation they're in.
He uses those kinds of words to remind everyone of his intellectual life before he was confined. Maybe it's a way to maintain a sense of superiority in that restricted environment.
And of course, we have the formal language of meetings and therapy sessions.
Yeah.
Therapy itself, non-restricted for
Yeah.
privileges. Those words define the structure of their confinement and how they're being treated.
They set the boundaries, dictate the supposed path to recovery. But those terms often clash with the patient's actual experiences and their own ideas about what treatment should be.
Exactly. And even a word like satisfy takes on different, sometimes loaded meanings depending on the context and who's using it. Okay, we've covered slang and formal language. Now let's dive into the really good stuff. The metaphors and the imagery in the novel.
This is where Kesey really shines as a writer. The book is full of powerful metaphors and imagery that convey the characters' inner states and the suffocating atmosphere of the institution. The fog, as Chief Bromden experiences it, is probably the most powerful metaphor. It represents his mental confusion, his feeling of being lost and controlled. It's like a deliberate blurring of reality that he sees all around him in the ward.
It really is. And it's not just a delusion in his mind. The fog is connected to the Combine, that symbol of oppressive forces that he believes is controlling everything. How does the language link those two ideas together?
Through Chief Bromden's narration, Kesey links the fog's intensity to the influence of the Combine and Nurse Ratched, who represents it. When Chief feels powerless, the fog is thickest. But when McMurphy challenges the system, the fog lifts, showing a direct link between resistance and clear thinking. It's like the Combine's machinery and Nurse Ratched's actions are literally creating the fog in his mind.
The imagery of machinery is really striking, too. It's always associated with the institution and Nurse Ratched, who is compared to a clock. The institution is like a cold, impersonal factory processing people, not treating them as individuals. What do you think this mechanical imagery tells us about Kesey's view of the institution?
It dehumanizes the whole system.
Yeah.
By comparing the ward to a factory and Nurse Ratched to a clock, he's saying they treat people like cogs in a machine, taking away their individuality and treating them with cold efficiency instead of empathy. It's a critique of that whole approach to mental health.
It's bleak. And it's significant how the fog disappears when McMurphy shows up and starts disrupting things. It's almost like a visual representation of his impact on the other patients' minds. His rebellious energy is like a breath of fresh air, clearing away the fog of control.
Exactly. It connects McMurphy's rebellious spirit with a liberation from mental oppression. Chief Bromden and the other patients start to see through the institution's facade.
McMurphy himself is presented in contrasting ways, too. At first, through Chief's eyes, he's this almost mythical giant come out of the sky. But as the story goes on, we see his flaws, his vulnerabilities. He becomes human. What do you think that shift in imagery tells us about the novel's ideas about heroism?
It challenges the idea of a perfect hero. By showing McMurphy's human side, Kesey suggests that real heroism isn't about being invincible. It's about fighting for what's right and inspiring others, even when you're flawed and you know you might fail. It's a more realistic, relatable kind of heroism.
The metaphor of the cuckoo's nest is so powerful, too. It compares the patients to broken clocks that Nurse Ratched and the institution are trying to fix.
It sums up perfectly how they view the patients as broken things that need to be repaired and made to conform. It highlights how they ignore individuality and try to force everyone into this narrow definition of what's considered normal.
And even time becomes this battleground in the ward. Nurse Ratched controls clock time, that rigid schedule that rules their lives. But McMurphy and eventually Chief Bromden start to experience natural time, a more organic sense of time passing. What do you think this contrast in how they experience time represents?
It's the core conflict between control and freedom. Clock time represents the institution's oppression. Natural time represents a return to a more authentic, less controlled existence. It's about reclaiming a sense of self.
Now let's touch on those cultural and literary references Kesey uses. They really place the story in a specific American context.
Absolutely. The references to figures like Popeye, Frankenstein, Sandy Koufax, Mickey Mantle, and the Lone Ranger instantly connect the story to American culture of that time. It's a world that readers would have recognized.
Even mentioning Beaverton, Oregon helps to ground the setting in a real place.
It makes the ward, which is fictional, feel like a place that could actually exist. It adds realism and specificity.
And there's that moment when a list of writers is mentioned. It suggests a certain awareness of literature, both within the story and maybe in terms of how Kesey saw his own work.
It could be interpreted in different ways, maybe hinting at the novel's literary ambitions or drawing connections between the patient's experiences and themes explored by those writers.
And the description of McMurphy as a cowboy out of the TV set is so insightful. It connects him to that classic American image of the rugged individualists fighting injustice.
It explains his rebellious nature, his role as an outsider, his instinctive resistance to any kind of oppression. He's like a modern-day cowboy, but in a mental institution.
Finally, let's talk about how all this language we've been discussing reveals the bigger themes of the novel.
The language each character uses reflects the power dynamics in the institution. Nurse Ratched's controlled, clinical language shows her authority, while the patient's informal, often rebellious speech shows their lower status and their efforts to resist her.
It's exactly. McMurphy's constant use of informal, rebellious language is a direct challenge to Nurse Ratched and the institution. He uses his words to inspire the other patients to question and resist the oppressive rules of the ward.
And the way Chief Bromden's narration changes throughout the novel is very revealing. As his mental state improves, his language becomes more coherent and insightful. He goes from fragmented thoughts to powerful observations about his environment and the people around him.
It's amazing to see that transformation. And the way sanity and insanity are talked about in the book highlights how subjective those labels are. It raises questions about who has the power to decide who's sane and who isn't.
The novel constantly challenges the very definition of those terms. The patients struggle to understand them within the context of the institution, and their language reflects that.
And the theme of masculinity is so important. The way they talk about strength, vulnerability, and sexuality, especially within the all-male ward, shows how they're wrestling with traditional ideas of what it means to be a man.
They're trying to redefine masculinity within a very controlled environment that often makes them feel less than a man. Their language reveals their insecurities and their attempts to find a new way of being masculine in that setting.
Wow. We've really done a deep dive into the language of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. It's clear that Kesey's vocabulary and expressions aren't just there for decoration. They're essential for understanding this amazing book and its layers of meaning.
Absolutely. The language is a direct path to understanding the characters, the power dynamics, and the social commentary. Hopefully our listeners have had some aha moments along the way.
I hope so too. It makes you think about how language shapes reality in any closed community, whether it's a workplace, a family, or even an online group. What can we learn about power, rebellion, and identity just by paying attention to the words people use?
That's a great point. It raises questions about how language creates and reinforces social structures and identities. And thinking specifically about One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, what other layers of meaning could we uncover if we keep exploring it through this lens of language?
It's a fascinating question to think about. We encourage all of you listening to keep exploring the novel and consider the power of language in shaping not just the stories we read, but also the world we live in.